Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, John Hubbard, and again with me for our special 11 Strategies of a World-Class Cybersecurity Operations Center season here, we have our three authors, Ingrid Parker, Carson Zimmerman, and Kathryn Knerler. Welcome back, everyone. Are we ready to talk hiring and growing quality staff today?
Yes,
absolutely.
Definitely.
One of our favorite strategies.
One of the most important ones, too.
Yeah, no definitely. Always excited to get into this sort of thing because, teaching SOC management classes and SOC analysts and everything, there's always a lot of questions around how do we build the best possible team, right? Which I'm sure is one of the things that got this to make the cut as one of the 11 strategies. What I'd love to hear to kind of kick this off would be, of course, why it's important and why it made the cut in the book, although we all probably know that to some degree, but your take on it, as well as maybe how has this changed from the previous book? Because there was a little bit of a wording difference and things have evolved since the first edition of the book. So could you speak a little bit to kind of those factors to get us started off here?
I could talk a little bit about first edition. In the first edition of the book, we had a section to the effect of favor staff quality over quantity. And the original intent of that conversation focused around, what skill set am I looking for? And, who do I hire, rather than just pouring people on the problem of more alerts, more cases, and more data. And for second edition, Ingrid and Kathryn showed up. And it's also worth noting that all three of us have been individual contributors in SOCs for a very long time, and all three of us have been managers in SOCs for a very long time. So we bring both perspectives. And, in the second edition here, we expanded the scope of the conversation to kind of cover all things staffing, having just discussed in the previous chapter organization. And this is near and dear, I think, to all our hearts.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you with that. Been an analyst, been a SOC manager, and I know getting the right people on the team when I was playing the manager role was something I was constantly worried about, right? It's a tough thing. It's hard to find people. The market out there is very rough. You get tons and tons of resumes, trying to figure out which one's going to be the best, getting all the time to interview everyone. It's a tough thing, right? As you all know. So I'm very, very interested to hear what everyone has to say on this one. Starting with the beginning of strategy 4, just section 4.1, right? We have whom should I hire, and jump right into mindset and soft skills. So I guess to kick off this conversation, let's start with some basic questions here. Let's say you're building a SOC and you're trying to hire some people. Let's start with entry level assumption, right? SOC analysts, or really any role. What are the kind of core traits we are looking for, in your opinion, of people that we would want to have working in the SOC that may have not done this job before?
I think when you get started, especially talking entry level, we still are seeing job postings for entry level with college degree and knows 5 different tools and has taken this certification and has been doing this for 3 to 5 years. And it's like, that is not entry level. Entry level is maybe you've got a foundation in some other part of IT. So maybe you've been a system administrator, or maybe you are just coming out of a college or a community college or a technical program, or maybe you are, we're seeing this a lot, people transferring in from liberal arts type of areas, but they have that critical thinking piece where, and an interest and a passion in the technology space where you can bring that together. And so that's actually why we started with the soft skills piece, because it's not about, can you run a particular tool set, or can you do, XYZ. It's when given a piece of data and you have to go investigate it, how are you going to think about that? How are you going to actually process? And then how are you going to engage with others on your team? Because, this is a continual learning environment. Like, every one of us on this call probably has learned something new in the past week about cybersecurity that we didn't know before. You never are going to stop. And so finding that person who wants to come in and engage with the others on your team and learn the pieces that they need to, it's not to say that, they like you have to have an interest in technology. You have to be willing to go dive in. You have to say, okay, I need to understand the fundamentals of networking. I need to understand how, a computer system works. I need, those are things you have to be able to pick up. But for the true entry level, going to be processing alerts, going to be working through some basics, I think there's just a bar that sometimes seems like it's set so high, and it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, and I'll build on that. So just to sum it up, don't look for the unicorn, right? We hear that a lot where we are. We're looking for the unicorn. They can do all things, and they don't exist, right? To add to that mindset, it's not just the critical thinking piece; it's creativity and also curiosity. So curiosity is probably the biggest characteristic that I look for, and I've hired like more than 160 entry level professionals into this field. And I look for that curiosity. So they may not know the answer. In fact, they probably don't know the answer, and that's fine. But they'll explain, oh, I have never thought of it that way. Or, gosh, that would be really cool if I went in and explored it. So I really look for that interest and curiosity in the field more than ever. Because what I find is that the field, like they were saying, it changes every day. We learn something new every week. And if you get tired of learning, if you think you can learn it all, this is probably not the right field for you.
Absolutely. That's an incredible amount of people you've gone through the whole process with. So I would love to hear kind of your take on what you do and like your process behind how do you measure, I guess, curiosity and creative thinking, especially in a way that's going to transfer as clearly as it can into a SOC work environment. Is there any particular approach you take?
Yeah, so I'm not just hiring for security operations. I'm also hiring for other aspects of security. And Ingrid alluded to it. I don't just look for someone who has a background with an engineering degree. When you're hiring entry level, you're looking for maybe some basics. If it's someone who's messed around with computers a lot in their spare time, that counts. And they can talk a lot about how they work and how they interact, and some things about cybersecurity. That's interesting. For us, we had a program at MITRE for new professionals. So that's why I was hiring so many of them, and we were hiring for specific kinds of, sponsor work. So what I was looking for there is what I just said, is the curiosity, the creativity, and then the critical thinking skills. In fact, I don't want them to know the answers. I want to hear their mindsets and how they think through a problem and how they logic it out. So yeah, that's the main thing. It's a big secret.
Yeah. And I think when you look at those resumes, you'll find a lot of people who have, I saw this on some of them, like they'd go do a capture the flag activity. Even though they might not be the person who knows all the answers, they would go join a team at their school and just see what it was all about. Or maybe they work with, a local group, that they belong to, and they're like, oh, I'm going to help you with your IT for that organization that doesn't have any other support. Or there's all these indicators you can find on a resume that have nothing to do with a specific education or training course. I've seen that they put down, hey, I have XYZ lab at home and I've tried to do this. So all of these pieces you can look at and be able to pick up on that show that they're doing something more than just waiting to be handed a curriculum that they have to follow.
For all the listeners out there that might be in the stage of looking for a job right now, I assume between all of us, we've seen probably thousands and thousands of resumes. Any tips on the do or do not do side that you'd like to give out to listeners who might be looking for that next job?
Well, don't have spelling mistakes. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. That's just kind of a normal
thing. A whole range of things, like the generic things you do and don't do on a resume, like spelling mistakes and, obviously poor formatting. And hey, if you're going to put something on your resume, I'm going to ask you about it. And, if you're going to put CCNA or CISP or whatever on your resume, great. I'm going to ask you questions that are commensurate with that certification. And the same goes for formal education, or any of your project, or anything you put on your resume is fair game. As a matter of fact, one of the things I think about when I'm hiring is, unlike even 10 or 15 years ago, the SOC today, the bigger the SOC, the more this is the case. You have to treat it like a band or a sports team. In that, to the novice, you might see, oh, that's a musician. But if you, immediately as you start to understand things, you understand the difference between a bass player and a drummer. I don't, but I know there's a big difference. I'm not musically inclined, by the way. And one of the things I think about that is here. And one of the things I think about is, how did they come by that base level of experience, right? And it could be because they went to school for it. It could be as they're a developer. They could have pivoted in from another area of cybersecurity. There's a million ways to know about it. But one of the things I'll ask people is, amongst the million things I'll ask people is, especially if they've been in the SOC before, how did they evolve their capabilities and the capabilities of the people around them? How do they lift themselves up, and how do they lift up the people around them? And I want to see the evidence of that. And I want to see the evidence of curiosity and technical aptitude in something. In fact, I ask purposely open-ended technical questions that'll allow the candidate to go any direction they want. From, tell me what you know about IRQs, to tell me what you know about BGP, to DNS, to system level programming, to cloud architectures, to what have you. Because I don't expect them to know it all. Like Kathryn was talking about, we're never looking for the unicorn, but I expect them to bring some of that diversity to bear.
Yeah, diversity in thought. So if we have we have 3 system administrators, we're going to look for, I don't know, a cloud developer. We're going to look for someone who's slightly different than the others on the team to round out the thought process. Because if you all think alike on the team, you're always going to come to the same conclusions, right? So sometimes you have to be super creative and bring someone in that has a completely different way of looking at the world.
Yeah. I want to pick up on one thing Carson said, which is, when you're putting your resume together, not just stating a fact like you did X, Y, Z, but talking about the impact and the outcome that came from it.
Yeah.
I did this, which resulted in, this improvement, this change. We found this adversary, or, if you're not talking about cyber, it improved my business in this way, or it helped this person. That's a really important part, because that differentiates you from all the people that have a skill to how you can apply that skill and actually make it really relevant. And then I was also thinking, as we're talking about resumes, like resumes are still really important, but remember that for many companies, those go through an automated process. So making sure your keywords, like think about the keywords, make sure you've got certain terms on there. But resumes are also like only part of the battle when you're looking for a job. It really is, who do you know? How do you do networking? And if you're just getting started, that might seem overwhelming, but it's go on LinkedIn, find some people that work for those companies, reach out to them, maybe even before you're looking at a job. Maybe you're still in school, do something else, and make it personal. Like if I get a LinkedIn invite and it's just like a, hey, join my network, I'm like, I don't know who you are. I mean, you're probably a lovely person, but I don't know who you are. And I've gotten some great ones from students in particular who said, hey, I saw this book, or I saw a presentation, or I, looked at your history and it was really interesting for this reason. I'd love to connect. And so doing that is going to be really important in addition to the resume to really build that network, because I think as you go farther and farther along in your career, very rarely are you going to be blindly applying. You're going to be reaching out to your network, and then your network is going to help you find whatever's next.
Yeah, and stick with it. You may not get the first one some of it's a little bit of luck. So you just have to keep, luck favors the prepared. So keep trying. I think a lot of my jobs have come just because I didn't give up. I just kept trying different things.
Yeah. There's a lot of opportunities out there for going for like local information security conferences, or even national ones, right? Where there's like a component where there's a hiring village, resume review, and stuff like that. So just getting help and getting more eyes on your resume. That's kind of a tip I would throw in there as well. The other thing I was thinking is like what to put on the resume. And my quick tip on that from my point of view is like, put stuff that's relevant. We don't need to see all the way back to like your high school lifeguard job kind of thing. Like order things in the order of like, I'm applying to a SOC analyst job. Here are the things that are going to be most relevant to that, right? As opposed to chronological order or just everything you've ever done. If it's not like super relevant, curate it, right? And try to customize it for maybe even each individual company, right? That's an approach that can help you just kind of maximize chance for impact. So that's
fascinating, because, and I think this is one of the challenges when people are talking about resumes. I love chronological resumes. And I love resumes that have things on them that are not necessarily directly in alignment, especially if you're doing career changes or something else.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's one of the things to keep in mind is people are reading your resume and giving you advice. You're going to get conflicting advice. You're going to have people with different opinions, and you're going to have to sort out for yourself what you want to share about yourself. Because I get frustrated when I see functional resumes that don't have a chronological order, just because that's how I like to see them. So yeah, I love that you've got like one approach to it, and I've got another. And so this, back to Kathryn's point of view, you have people with different viewpoints in the industry, and you want to bring them in. But there is no one perfect resume.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's, I mean, it's a good point. I guess what I was thinking in my mind there is I've seen some resumes that are like very, very long, and I'm like, it could have been like half the size because I don't really need to know, like, okay, I'm glad you had a job. There's, the chronological, continuous, whatever. But like, yeah, like if you want to fill out a page and you need to have the, stuff, whatever. My preference is like, I'm looking at 100 resumes, right? I need to get through these quickly. So help me help you by highlighting the things that are going to make me say, hey, that's a person I want to interview, right?
Yeah, that's very true. 3 pages kind of gets to be too much.
Yeah.
The old school, no more than 2 pages is still a pretty relevant, mark for somebody who has that kind of career history. And 1 page or less, 1 page is perfectly fine for somebody who's new and entering. Like, you do not need to pad it and make it longer.
One of the things I wanted to mention about skills and those kind of initial informationals that I have is a combination of foundational skills relevant to the SOC. And like I said, it's not necessarily certifications, though they are helpful. It's not necessarily educational experience, though that's helpful, right? There's different ways of coming upon the information. But it's the notion of the diversity of background and transferable experiences and skills. And this is really interesting how things have evolved over the 20 years that I've been doing it. When I went and got my undergrad degree, you didn't really go to school for cybersecurity. And that's not the case anymore, of course. And one of the interesting conversations I've had with more than a few people who got their degrees in cybersecurity of one form or another is okay, great, cyber, but do you know how networks, cloud, and computers work as well? Hopefully the answer is yes. Why do I say that? I am of the unswerving opinion that one of the most fundamental and most important technical skills, meaning a non-soft skill for someone in a SOC, is they need to understand how these things work. And because the more they understand how networks, computers, and cloud works, the better their ability is to understand what's normal and abnormal on them. And that's the big piece of the job.
So I've shifted over the years, believe it or not. So I was pretty hardcore. You have to have a technical. You better understand how the hardware is put together, the software. You better know everything about TCP/IP, IPv6. That was my view probably, I don't know, 7-8 years ago. I've changed because I have hired so many. That diversity of thought comes from diversity of knowledge as well. Now, I wouldn't suggest you go out and hire 15 English majors in your set. But I would say that a good critical thinking analyst, and by the way, I have hired an English major, added to a group of super techie, just fondly nerds. I'm a nerd, so I'm going along with that. Can really change the dynamics and what you can find. And sometimes that analyst is the one that's like, have you thought of this? And it's almost that simplistic beginner's mind that's like, oh my gosh, we didn't think of it. So I am shifted a little bit on that over time. You don't have to have a hardcore technical degree, I don't think. So, right, Ingrid?
Yeah. So I was actually an art major in college. And so, yes, but I went from an art major to being a system administrator in the Army. And so I got some of the fundamentals that Carson's talking about, and then transitioned that into cybersecurity later on. And so I think, I was one of those people where cyber was not even a degree, and, women going into IT was not as popular, when I was doing it. So I ended up in a different field. But many of the people that I work with, have worked for me. I've worked for other things. I've come in from some very non-traditional backgrounds. So there is room for everybody in this field.
No,
Please come in. Please come in.
There's no question, right? I've hired people who had degrees or no degrees in microbiology, being a medical tech, liberal arts for sure, you name it.
I hired a chef.
Right on.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's funny when I poll like classrooms, how many people here started in InfoSec, and it's like no one. Like it's getting more and more, like, especially with the younger crowd, where those degrees did exist, but like almost universally, right? When you get to a certain age, everyone above is like, nah, that I did not. I came from somewhere else, right? Myself, I came from engineering background, so tangentially related. I used computers, but not like this, right? And so, yeah, we all kind of found our way in somewhere. So, if that's any of the listeners out there thinking like, how do I get in there? Everyone figured it out. It can be done. Absolutely.
So that is a common question I get. We can go into here is how do
Sure.
I get started in this field? And I'll start with my answer, and I'm curious what Ingrid and Carson have to say about it. I used to say incident response is the best way to get started because you get to see what an adversary looks like in the technology, and follow it through. But I've shifted there a little bit too. I have found that system administrators they know a lot about what's normal and what's not normal. So they're really, that's a good way to start too, is just trying to be a system administrator. Over to you all.
Oh, I think security is so big. Security operations is just one part of it. And so getting in really at any point that you can. So maybe that's working, you're doing vulnerability scans, or maybe you are a system administrator, or maybe you're doing more policy related work or other types of things. There are other places where you can start that maybe will get you in the door with some of those different degrees and give you the time to then go and learn some of the skills that are more focused on what the security operations piece is. So I think my piece is just take the job that's out there. Like, you're going to move around. Whatever job you start with is not where you're going to end. So just start somewhere, do something, do it for 2 years, figure out what you don't like, figure out what you do like, and then make the next choice.
Yeah, and as soon as you get on that kind of first rung of I got a first security job, things tend to get a lot easier after that because you build up skills so quickly, right? And so it's that first step that's usually the hardest one, but it can absolutely be done because many of us have done it. Nearly everyone has done it still in the industry at some point, right? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I don't know if any of you have done like manager level hiring, but in the book, it also gets into like, what are we looking for in SOC leaders, and any thoughts on like, if you've done that kind of interview, how do we assess who would be good for leading a group of cybersecurity ops teams?
So yes, I've hired managers as well as individual contributors. And I think you have to understand your culture and what the expectations are for that manager, and how much is it a technical manager and how much of it is a people manager. And especially like when I was at MITRE, it was a very hybrid organization, and those were actually two different roles sometimes. Or you might have, somebody who's doing, more project management type of work versus managing the people. If it is a single role where you're doing both, I actually start from the people aspect and really, do they want to manage other people? Do they get satisfaction not being that person that goes in and finds the really cool thing, like, oh, the adversary just did X, but are they going to get excited because one of their staff members found that? And then are they going to advocate for them? And they're going to make sure they get their training? Or are they going to, really, are they a good communicator who can speak, up to leadership about the SOC? So they have to have a level of technical depth to be competent in the space and have the conversations and, raise the BS flag when something's going on. But a lot of this depends on the size of your organization. So if you're a 4-person team and you're going to be managing 3 others, you're going to need to have, more hands-on technical skills day to day. You're going to have to be able to get in there with your team. If you're going to be leading 10, 15 people, then your team is going to have different expectations for you. And that was actually one of the things I found really, interesting as I was learning to be a leader, was that it's somewhat about what I bring to the team, but it's also what the team needs from me. And so sometimes I would be managing a very technical team, and they would need me to stay out of their business, and to manage the leadership and manage the communications and make sure that they had the resources they needed. And other teams were like, hey, we're newer, or we just have more early career people or something else. We need you to get in the trenches with us. So I think when you're hiring a manager, you need to recognize that there's many different roles and it's not just one, and you have to figure out what it is you need out of that person, and then kind of balance the people and the technology aspects.
Yeah, definitely. It's not like it's not purely being the alpha nerd role, right? It's like you're enabling others more so than anything else, and making sure all of the gears are going to be turning without any kind of impediment, and things will be running smoothly, and you stay on top of that, right? And those kind of things.
I'll tack on a couple things here. There's all the generic things that we talk about in terms of, what makes a good leader and hiring for good managers, people managers, et cetera. That all applies here. With that out of the way, I'll also highlight, we haven't yet talked as much about soft skills. One of the things that I think about for managers in a SOC, other than being a good people leader and knowing, when to get involved and when to get out of the way and all that good stuff, is sound decision making, particularly in a crisis. A large percentage of the roles in a SOC, get involved in incident response, and they need to be able to make sound decisions there. And there's a bunch of things that go into that. Understanding the business, understanding how SOCs operate, understanding what their people need, having to make difficult decisions sometimes with competing priorities, all of that good stuff. Know how to looking out for yourself and people around you when you get crispy, meaning when you've been at an incident for 10 days straight and your judgment is no longer optimal, and the judgment of the people around you is no longer optimal. And how do you operate when that happens? So I've always biased toward managers in a SOC who have at least one of those cybersecurity experiences, and or technical leadership experiences. To a degree, I feel like they need to be able to empathize with the people working for them.
Do you think it's possible for a non-technical person to make for an effective SOC manager? Sometimes that's a question that comes up in class as well. I'd love to hear your take on that. Like someone that hasn't been a SOC analyst.
That's a good question. So there's a couple of things that I look for in leaders, and that's adaptability and the ability to delegate. So those things above all are super important. If you hire someone who doesn't have the technical background, you sort of lose that piece of is there is the sound decision making still able to happen? So if you're not a technical one, then again, back to that team concept where you better have a real senior person who is super trustworthy, that you can pair up with and count on to be that role, right? So if you don't have that background yourself, you have to supply, that's how leaders build, right? You build your weaknesses are the people you hire around you, right? to help augment your abilities.
To fill out the band, right? As Carson
Fill
was
up the
saying.
band, that's right.
Can't have all bass players.
That's right.
Yeah.
But that adaptability comes into play, especially in incident response. We've had to turn many times where we headed down a path. We thought it was a certain adversary and a certain thing that was happening. It turned out to be completely different. And that ability to reset and say, all right, I didn't have it right, or my team didn't have it right, and let's all move in this new direction is very key when you're doing incident response.
Yeah, there's a lot of really important roles that managers have to play, and it's wearing a whole bunch of different hats and trying to wear them all at once effectively. It's not an easy task, right? One of the things that comes up next in the book is once you have those people on the team and you've picked that person, how do we make sure that they're going to be successful? So I'd love to hear your take on making training plans. How should we do training? How much training? Kind of that sort of thing.
I'll go. We've all got feelings about all of this. I'm gonna hit the training piece once. a lot of people have really strong feelings about trainings, and it's interesting to see how many people gravitate toward the, I have to have $10,000 a year as an individual contributor. I have to have the SOC spend 15 grand on me every year to go to either a conference or a formal training of some sort. We all agree that these are useful things, right? I go to conferences all the time. They're very useful for me. I haven't met a person who didn't feel like that was the case. But, I've said this at least 3 times, so this will probably be my 4th. Constant learning on the job training needs to be baked into the SOC in terms of capacity. Everybody's got to be feeling like they're learning something new. They're going to leave. Different people have different motivations, et cetera. But to me, that's one of the most common.
Yeah.
And I think there's a difference between, hey, you're doing your job and so you're learning something, and a deliberate practice of, hey, you're going to take 2 hours a week that you don't have to be in the queue, that you're not doing hunting, that you're going to be able to step away and go put on, set headphones and listen to a podcast, or go set up a VM and do some research, or do something else that kind of refreshes you from the other things that you're doing. On a different tactic, I also want to talk about the importance of non-technical training. This is something I've seen a lot of, is that people naturally in this field are really excited about the technical things. They jump into it. There's plenty of materials. But for a lot of people, for their growth, there are other skills that are really important to them. So learning communication, learning planning, learning these other things. And there are some great options out there. And so I think working with your teams to say, what is it you need this year? Is it that you need to go learn, we're going to transition SIM, so you need to go learn whatever that new SIM technology is? Is it that you want to go learn a new kind of area, so maybe you want to go do machine learning or cloud or something you haven't done before? Or is it you need to think about you as how you communicate, how you engage people? So you need to work on those communication skills. You need to work on something else. And so there's, I would challenge a lot of leaders to think that it's not just, let me go find XYZ technical skill and go make sure they're there. Think about the whole person, and think about how they can grow in a lot of different dimensions. And I've seen so many people that have just loved taking those non-technical courses.
Yeah. And I guess I would add that I've learned as a manager that everyone learns differently. So because everybody learns differently, there isn't like one kind of training. Like not everybody can get something out of SANS. I'm a book reader, so which is kind of a problem for me. There aren't as many books as there used to be. It's a lot of online kind of learning. But you just have to work with people on how do they learn best? Do they have to try it out? Do they want to, have little virtual environments and configure things? So people learn differently, but I'm with Carson. My favorite's OJT, and pairing more senior people up with more less experienced people. That's one of my very favorites, the apprenticeship style of learning, because I think learning goes faster when someone can try things out. And then they get stuck and they have someone that's more experienced they can ask, and they can kind of get the context of, oh, no, in this environment, this is how it works, So,
Yeah.
And to build on that brings up 2 points there. One is, and it helps the person who is on the more senior perspective, because they're learning how to mentor, they're learning how to teach. You gain a deeper knowledge as you have to train somebody else. And so they can get a set of skills, like, maybe they want to go be a manager, but they haven't actually managed a team before. But now they can say, oh, but I've mentored this person and this is how I help them transform. And here's when they had a challenge, this is how I dealt with it. So it can be really powerful for that senior person too. And then I would add the caution of, but not all senior people really enjoy this.
I was going to say, can I put a plug out there that all the senior people out there, if you could just understand how important it is to pass on your knowledge. I work with a lot of curmudgeons, and it would be super great if we would all take just a little time and teach someone next to you.
And that can take its form in different ways, and it may not come off as overt mentorship or apprenticeship. And that goes to a bunch of other things, we'll talk about in this chapter and others, among them writing down what we're supposed to do in an SOP, to adding another line to the spreadsheet of all the data sources you know about, to contributing that crazy script you wrote last week to your team's code repo. So it can manifest itself in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. There was really two questions that kind of popped up in my mind throughout that. So the first one, for Ingrid, any just quickly resources that you have used for non-technical training, in the communication, presentation, any of those kinds of skills that you've had success with in the past?
So one course that I got to take when I was at MITRE, and I recently had somebody on my team go through, is called Crucial Conversations. I was trying not to advertise any particular place, but it has been very successful. It is something that I enjoyed and that I've heard a lot of others enjoy. Another one out there is Trusted Advisor, especially for your more senior teams, your leaders. That's a great one for how you build trust with others. And especially if you're trying to do that up and around your organization, that can be a great technique as well. So those are two that I've taken and I know others have taken and gotten a lot out of.
Awesome. Thanks for that. The other thing I was wondering was, Kathryn, you had mentioned kind of the mentorship. Well, really, everyone was talking about mentorship. But the question I was thinking was, is this something that you would like? How do you implement it, really, is what I'm asking. Is this a formal thing? Do you assign everybody?
Oh,
somebody?
gosh, no. So the best mentorships are definitely informal and they're natural. So if you see two people, as a leader, that's kind of one of the things I look out for, right? So if I see two people are seeming to, they have some similarities or some common interests, I might do a little matchmaking there and say, hey, there's a mentor-mentee kind of relationship there. But it definitely has to be informal. And, to Carson's point, sometimes I don't even call it that, right? It's just two people working together side by side, and one has more questions than the other. So that's not necessarily a mentorship. That's more that's how you work as a team. And some senior folks don't exactly like the idea of being a mentor. So that works a little better.
And I'll mention, this is going to kind of lead into, it's chapter 10, I think it was. Those relationships, don't just think about them inside the SOC. Think about those mentorships, or shall we say non-mentorship relationships, going in either direction and out of the SOC. In particular, with both the SOC's key customers and with the red team. I love it when someone inside the SOC forms a relationship with someone in the red team, and they don't need to necessarily talk about their operations. Be like, hey, I'm kind of going after this set of services or this set of techniques in the next 6 months. We should learn about that together. And it can be really cool.
Yeah, and just to emphasize Carson's point about mentors, I have mentors. I highly recommend every single person out there should find mentors in their life, because they really can guide you and kind of help you work through some of the harder things in workplaces, right? And make work more enjoyable and more fulfilling. My mentors don't necessarily work at the company I'm at. It just depends on, what you need at that point. Like, I have leadership mentors, I have technical mentors, I have, different folks for different kinds of things that I need. So I recommend everybody have them.
Yeah, useful for everyone for many, many things, right? Carson, to what you said, with the red team, right? I want to definitely echo that, right? Being friends with, getting mentored by, whatever you want to call it, having a contact of someone who can act like an attacker can be invaluable, right? Because you have those conversations where like, oh yeah, we're looking at this data, we're looking at that, and like, oh well, I can just do this, and then maybe that triggers something in your head like, oh yeah, how would I catch if they do that? And let's make no mistake about it, right? The red team's job is to make their own job harder. So they should be willing to share that stuff with you, right? They shouldn't be like hiding their techniques, because like they're supposed to be helping you find their techniques, right? So that's something that can absolutely be very, very useful, and I've experienced that myself as well. So totally awesome thing to be friends with pen testers if you're on the blue team side.
Yeah, and threat hunters as well.
Yes,
they have a whole different creative way of thinking that's useful.
Yeah, definitely. Getting that kind of cross pollination. And that's where, you mentioned in the book, kind of doing rotations, maybe slightly tangential to the SOC and other things like that can be very, very useful as well, whether it's in pen testing or vuln management or anything really. If it's a transferable skill, that can be a great way of kind of avoiding some of the problems and burnout and some other things that we kind of had mentioned previously. And actually, we're about to get into in the next little section here. 4.3, create an environment that encourages staff to stay. I want to start this one kind of asking the opposite. What are some of the most common things you all have run into that are complaints that cause people to leave a security operations team?
I want to kick it off with doing things exactly the same way you were doing them a year ago.
Yup.
Like if nothing changes and you haven't automated, like if you're still manually doing something that somebody could have written a script for and you're still just having to hunt and peck those keys, like it just pisses people off to no end. And so like, you want to, most people in this field want to be able to continue to be challenged, and it is not challenging to do the same thing all the time. And that was probably Carson's too, because I know he is also very passionate
you
about
nailed
this
it.
one.
Yeah, there is nothing more demoralizing than doing something that could be done easier or in an automated way, and no one's doing it.
Yes.
What else?
Well, Ingrid, go ahead, Kathryn.
Okay. Well, not providing the environment to grow. So maybe you don't want to just look at alerts for your whole career. To Ingrid's point, you don't want to do the same job. Most people don't want to look at alerts for more than a year or two at the most. And so they want to grow into other things like some incident response or some red teaming or some threat hunting or anything else. So being able to provide an environment that allows people to move around is super important.
There's a
I
section.
agree. People often talk about burnout in SOCs as a source of attrition, and I agree with that and disagree with it simultaneously. And here's why. I actually agree with what Ingrid and Kathryn were saying as the primary cause. My theory, which is not based on anything data driven, but my theory is based on the observation that a lot of people who join a SOC and don't just treat it as, I'll do this for 12 months and that's the end of it. A lot of those folks, not all of them, but a lot of them thrive on many aspects of what the SOC does, solving puzzles and responding to crises. And I've seen a lot of these folks put in long hours doing that week after week, where I think people end up rage quitting or just saying, I'm not here anymore, is that they're doing that and they don't feel like it's getting better. And the getting better is not just the SOC, it's also the rest of the enterprise. They want to be able to see that their findings and the root causes of incidents are being addressed. At least some of them are, right? And that, to me, is one of the reasons why a lot of folks sign up and stay on.
Yeah, forward progress, I think, is something that nearly universally people want to see, right? And if you don't have some sense of we are getting better here, absolutely, like that can be an easy source of frustration if they don't feel like any growth is happening there. That's a big factor in my mind and in my experience as well. I know that's something I always looked for. Other things that people like to grow, this might be a fun discussion, their paycheck. There's a section here on pay fair market value. Would love to hear kind of all related thoughts kind of on that. But one question I wanted to start off with this, because I know a lot of people have this problem. I hear this question all the time in class. I don't have the budget to pay people as much as I want to pay them. Like I will do it, but I cannot do it. How do those people maybe buffer that out with something else to still keep people on the team, make people want to join the team? How do we overcome that hurdle?
So this is one where the environment that you have can go a long way. Like you can't be so far down in the market value that it's just ridiculous for what you're doing. But if you have to be on the lower end of the spectrum, then figuring out, okay, how do you have flexibility in work location? Like that's huge. And it's really interesting right now with all the companies that are asking employees to come back, and yet there's still such a demand for people that want to work remote. So if you can you still offer remote work, you are going to have a leg up over some of the biggest tech companies out there. That's going to be huge. Maybe you can offer some flexibility in the number of hours that you work per week, or how and where they do their job, or all of these things can play in. Or like, I know when I was looking for my latest job, I was more interested in what I thought I could learn and what the people were going to be like than the particular dollar figure. And so if you have, we always talk about the fact that this is actually a very small community and your reputation precedes you, and people know what your operations are like, even on small teams. Like people are going to reach out and find out like, oh, you've only got 5 people on your team, but this is how they all feel about it. This is how they, what do they post to Twitter? What do they put on LinkedIn? Do they have blogs? Do they have something else? So if you can create that culture that is trying to do the best you can with what you have available, that is supported by management, like, so you're getting recognized for things, and you're not only just, the boss comes in when there's a problem, they yell at you and then they disappear. All of that can actually set you on a really good path to be able to, bring people in who might, who are at least open to a salary range versus always just looking for the top dollar. That being said, we put this in the book because you can't try and find that magical unicorn that Kathryn was talking about that can do cloud, can do mobile, can do, identity, is able to reverse your malware, and is going to look at your alerts, and you're going to pay them, the same as you would, entry level in a fast food type of place. It just isn't going to be viable. So you do need to understand what the marketplace will bear.
Yeah. Absolutely. The other thing I hear on this one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, is when you are paying fair market value, but one of your employees comes back to you with, hey, I just got its offer at this other place and it's another, whatever, $1,000 or something like that. What are your thoughts on approaching that? Do you match it? Do you say, thanks for all the great work, good luck, see you later? What do you do there?
Yeah, this is highly familiar to me. I've been through that a lot. So, as a manager, I've learned to let go, if you will. So, I've had my magical unicorns leave, and go make double what they were making, and I can't compete with that. So I've worked it out as a pipeline that I'm constantly looking for talent. Just kind of built in that I know I'm going to lose my wonderful unicorn that's so great at the job. I try to keep them as long as I can. I've had, some folks, and I'll just hold on to them as long as I can. And then I just know that they're going to leave me eventually. So I've already been looking, who are those up and comers? And if I don't have any, it's succession planning. If I don't have any up and comers, then I better hire some up and comers that probably aren't at that level yet, but can be pretty soon. So that's how I handle it. And I have to let the person who goes and doubles their salary, they just have to go,
I have a couple thoughts here. One of them is, I'm going to quote Ben Folds for a moment and say, there's always someone cooler than you. And that's even, people will talk to you and they're like, oh, you should be able to afford this really expensive talent. There's always someone who will pay more than you will. So keep that in mind. I completely agree with Kathryn was saying. Of course, one thing I'll add is it's really good if, as a manager, you can have a strong enough relationship with your people where you're talking to them about their careers routinely. In fact, this is kind of a standard expectation. Point being, with as many of your staff as you can, make them feel like they can talk to you about an offer before they've accepted it. Because once they come to you and they've accepted the offer, there's nothing you can do for them. In fact, I like to be open with people that, hey, tell me about it before. Why are, because I want to understand what your motivations are and if there's something I can do about it. And it goes back to everything we've discussed for the last half hour.
Yeah, that's excellent advice, Carson.
Is that where the communicate section came from?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I actually have done a few counteroffers, but they were for people in positions where there was just a slight, there could be made an argument for them to be at a different level or to be at a different pay scale that, we just maybe had not moved internally fast enough for the skills that they had. Or in one case, it was somebody who really was critical to a project. If they left at that time, the project would not have continued in the way that we needed it to. But we also knew that it probably was not going to be the final thing. Like, we just hey, we need you for another year. Please stick around while we're building that pipeline that Kathryn was talking about. Here's what we can do for you. And they did, 2 years later, they did move on, but we were all in the place where we needed to be. So sometimes you do have to make those trade-offs, but they need to be very deliberate because, if one person does it, they all talked. Is everybody going to do it? Are you being fair? Are you being equitable? There's just a lot of behind the scene things that go into it. So if you are going to do it, be very deliberate. And picking up what Carson was talking about, there may be other things that people are looking for besides just money. I had one person who I ended up helping them with a relocation package. They didn't want more money. They just needed to be in a different place and they needed help with it. And so we were able to help them relocate. Or somebody who just wanted to work they wanted a couple hours a week to work on a research project or something else. So see if there is something besides money motivating them. And sometimes you can get lucky that way.
That actually reminds me of something I forgot to mention earlier. It's an interesting phenomenon I've experienced. We hire people into a SOC and we want to retain the people in the SOC who are highly motivated to go chasing after an adversary. And they're highly motivated to do, either, communicate with others and drive incidents or go solve puzzles or build amazing tools or maybe a combination of these things. One of the things we need to be careful about are the people who are so committed that they work too many hours and get crispy, or they're kind of running either super hot or super cold, meaning they're either like going out of their minds, Mach 3 hair on fire, or they're super grumpy or what have you. And one of the important things, as leaders is we've got to help people modulate that and become emotionally aware and be available to each other. And one of the things, especially if we're hiring for people who have been in security operations for a while, one of the questions I like to ask is people's awareness around how to regulate that. And why am I saying all this is because people can become so passionate about this. They just keep going after something and it's like, hey, I need to tear you off that now. So it's helping people also maintain that objectivity.
Yeah. And making sure people aren't burning out, taking it, we've all probably met that person. They're like, yeah, I got 3 years of PTO stacked up. You're like, no, you need to take a break.
Oh my God.
Please. Yeah. Always important to kind of get that balance in there for people so that people don't, crash and burn eventually on doing that kind of stuff. We brought up the fact that people are going to leave no matter what you do, whether it's for pay, whether it's for life circumstances or otherwise. I'd love to hear a little bit about what you mentioned in the book about pre-planning for staff turnover. We mentioned building the pipeline, but is there anything specific that comes to mind where it's like these are the things you do and when you can feel okay that you do have that pipeline built?
Yeah, the first thing is to make sure you look for any single points of failure or single points of knowledge. So if you only have one person that knows this very, key thing for your environment, you got to make sure that either you know how to cover it or you have someone on your team that's learning it and knows how to cover it. The biggest thing I've seen are people have their own way of scripting things a lot. So they built their own little tools and their own little scripts and they work in their own little world. And then they become excellent because they've learned the environment over several years. So learning what they know about the environment and spreading that knowledge around is what I look for first. Single points of failure.
What else? Anything else jump to mind on that one?
I would, doubling down staff rotations and SOPs. Don't ever have like one person who is responsible for incident response coordination, or just one person who is responsible for investigation or investigation within a given scope. Always, as much as you can, if you're big enough for it, have that on-call, in a rotation schedule. And I don't just mean the folks doing alert triage. It will help you immensely and enforce and drive what Kathryn is talking about.
And we talk about documentation as part of this, and so it's just a general good SOC practice, but it becomes particularly important when you have, turnover between staff. And thinking about those single points of failure and thinking about the things that are really, really important. So, when there's an incident, you will do X, Y, Z, having that really well documented so that if the person who normally leads that incident response is not there, and this isn't even just about turnover, but it's even about they happen to be on vacation that week. They're out sick. They're doing you need to make sure you've got the documentation and then making sure you've built in the time for people to document as you go along. Documentation should not be and this is our week for doing documentation this year. And we're going to, everybody's going to do it. It should be add a line, just do the smallest minimal thing you can. So we have this where I am, where we keep intelligence profiles and we're constantly reminding ourselves, you don't have to write the entire profile. All you have to do is put a one-liner in about what you saw. Just do that update. And next week you do the update. And next week you do the update. And if you do that, you build the corpus over time versus trying to make it into a big thing. And so that's what I would say about documentation is try not to make it a big thing. Try to make it a constant thing that everybody does. And there isn't a documentation person on your team, because often somebody who is a better writer or good at it or doesn't complain as much ends up doing it. And it needs to be something that every single person on the team is doing continuously.
Yeah, I'm gonna double down on that as well. No one in the SOC is above writing documentation. No one in the SOC is above reading and using that documentation almost every day. And anyone who acts like they're above it,
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. Any specific tactics you all use or have seen used that are particularly good at inspiring people to want to keep that documentation up to date or write it in the first place? Other than a totally great tip on the do a little bit at once, right? Anything beyond that? Systems you've used, software, really anything along those lines?
Oh, this is so hard. We've tried so many different systems Okay, so my tip would be try and put it in as few places as possible. Because if you have 15 different systems, like you've got one for your use cases and one for your detections and one for how you do your IR and and then nobody remembers what's in what system or when you transitioned or what you're doing differently. So just pick one. So if you do your documentation in GitHub, great. If you use, Confluence, that's lovely. If you've got, OneNote documents that you share around, if you do Jupyter notebooks, whatever it is, to the extent possible, try and minimize the places that you store. And then the other thing I would say is don't worry so much about consistency. I've seen a really interesting shift from those of us that maybe have grown up in a more structured relational database type of environment and are used to, hey, we want everything to be labeled the same and looking the same. But search has become so great now that you really can use search as a way on top of your environments to find the things that you're looking for. And so I would say spend less time worried about the exact right format to put it in and more time just putting pen to paper and putting something into a limited set of systems that you can run a search across.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that is I bet everybody's been through this one too, where someone leaves and nobody has access to their stuff. Because it's under their name somewhere with their, so putting it in a place, whatever it is, scripts or, documentation where it's, I won't call it centrally accessible, but at least accessible to someone on the teams so that when people leave, there isn't this void of they took everything with them or it's lost forever because nobody can get into it. I think we talk about that later too.
I'll add one tactical thing there. It may sound really minor. Make it easy, right? Consolidate and make it easy for people to update. And also probably some people in the audience are probably thinking, oh, but I've got this really important SOP and then a manager must approve it. I don't disagree. think about having different levels of approval, meaning, if you're going to change one line in a thing because we call Alice, not Bob, great. Don't make that manager approval required. Just, think about it. You might have one or two different levels of scrutiny for your SOPs.
And actually, that you were asking earlier about environments and what makes them more fun. I like documentation, but I don't love formal documentation. So if there's informal ways of communicating and keeping things, located somewhere, that's what I would prefer. It makes it more fun. But if you have to get 5 levels of approval, I'm with Carson. You can't always work that way.
Yeah, sometimes a partial solution is just what you're going to have to be okay with, right? And that's way, way better than nothing at all. And I think that's a theme we've kind of seen come up multiple times kind of throughout our discussions here, is just get something done and iteratively improve on it, right? As a way of kind of approaching this. The last section in this chapter before we close it up here is titled, How Many Analysts Do I Need? Another one of those perpetual questions. Any thoughts on those who might be at the earlier end of building their SOC, or might be in a place where they're like, ooh, I don't think we have enough people, on coming up with, do you really need more people on your team, or how many people do you need?
Yeah. So I think you start here with understanding some of your business objective, going back to that first chapter of, know what you're protecting, why you're doing it, what your expectations are for the SOC. And so do you need to be 24/7? Like, what is your risk model for that? And that just sets some basic staffing numbers there in terms of how many people you need. And then once you know how you're going to do that, and whether you're working with an MSSP, outsourcing something else, then you have to look at what's actually coming in. So how many alerts are you getting? What level of data is available to you? And how are you doing in terms of the processing of that on a day-to-day basis? And so, if your alert queue is just backing up and backing up and backing up, like, that's a huge indicator that something needs to change. Now, that change may not be hiring. That change may be tuning, that change may be automation, that change may be a lot of different things, but that's where you start looking at, can you even hit the things that you're trying to do on a day-to-day basis? And then you start adding on the additional things you want to do to improve the SOC. So are you able to work on special projects and do other things that are going to make you, find new technologies, do everything else? So I think that's just a basic place to start, is understand your business and your risk model that tells you kind of how many hours you need to be covering, or what kind of model you have, what your organizational structure looks like, and then figure out, are you doing the basics?
Yeah, that makes, I think that totally makes sense. And I love looking at, the metrics on alert triage and like what's backing up and all that other kind of stuff. One of the other kind of ways of phrasing this would be, how would I know, the reverse question, right, is like, is there such a thing as a team that's too large? Or like, how do you know when the team has become bloated and they're like, we have too many people and not enough work being done, right? Have you ever run into that, or is that just like, that doesn't really exist?
I think, though, to the extent that it exists, and by the way, I don't think I've ever run into
I haven't seen it.
It was ever like, we've got too many people and not enough, and versus the data or the problems. Like, I don't think I've ever met anyone who said that. What I would rather say is go back to what we've talked about already, and that is that the SOC should always feel like it's constantly improving both its effectiveness and efficiency, and what it does and how it does it. The fact that the data volume, the alert volume, the incident volume is so closely tied to that effectiveness and efficiency question, and it changes so much over time. That's why this conversation about how many people do we need becomes so inverted and so bizarre for so many people, right? I've talked about this before. A lot of people try to put specific ratios on it, right? Especially in the early 2000s. There's certain organizations that come with us say, if you have this many sensors, you need this many people. Right? That, or you have this many alerts, you need this many people. I would encourage people not to try and oversimplify it, because it reads like the Drake equation if you're lucky. Right, the Drake equation is like this equation that you calculate the number of intelligent life forms that have been entering our atmosphere based on like 10 other factors. and they're all independent of one another. So, this is always a weird one. But what we did, and I won't go over it here, but in section 4 or 5, how many analysts do I need? We sat down and kind of talked about some of those guidelines for folks who are newer approaching the space to try and kind of figure out, like, where do I even begin thinking about this problem? But it's exactly what Ingrid talked about. And this is where, when we're figuring out how many people, we have to go back to the conversation about what's our mission scope. And I would reiterate that a lot of the pressure the SOC feels to hire more people, much of that is self-inflicted, meaning it's how they've chosen to scope their mission, or chosen to fire certain alerts, or chosen to even comply with a given regulation or law. And a lot of people like, oh, we have to notify these people of the thing. Why? Why do you feel like you're having to notify service owners 500 times a day? Was that you? Is that really what you need to be doing? And oftentimes the answer actually is no, you don't.
Yeah,
I think it gets... Oh, go ahead, Kathryn.
So as a manager, that how many analysts do I need question is one that I'm constantly tweaking. I work in enterprises where we might have started with, say, 10 analysts. Well, we found out we really needed 15 because of all the different, we added cloud environments and different things. And I've heard the reverse too, where, okay, I started with 10. Turns out I had 5 people who really weren't contributing too much, so I could downsize a little bit. So it's a management question, right? If you have some really effective analysts who are super good at several things, then you can branch out a little more. So maybe you add some functions you didn't have before. Like if you're not doing threat hunting, you would add that to the mix, or breach as a service, or, you start doing more advanced things and kind of evolve the SOC. At least that's what I do. So how many analysts? Well, for me, it's not a set answer, and it's going to evolve over time depending on the band that we got together, right?
Ingrid, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think very similar to what Kathryn's talking about. I was thinking back to our functions list that we had in our fundamentals chapter. And, there are basic things, in our definition of what a SOC does. And so there are basic things that your SOC needs to be able to do in terms of, identifying the threats, responding to them, doing your monitoring. But there are a lot of additional functions that you could also be doing. So are you going to have in-house malware analysis? Are you going to have a threat intelligence team that's part of the SOC? Are you going to be doing your own, testing, whether that's tabletop exercises or red teams or pen tests, whatever else. And so all of those come into play as well. And so when I was thinking about, talking about, hey, how many alerts are coming in? Are you doing your basic triage? Like that chain is one way of thinking about your staffing, but then you have to think about what are the expectations from your organization for those other functions. And that's where the improvement piece comes in. And so somebody once asked me from just a strict CTI, cyber threat intelligence perspective, like, well, how many intelligence analysts do you need? I said, every dollar you have, I can put to work. Like you can never have enough people. There is so much activity going on. Now there's probably a point at which that is not true. I have not run into that yet. So, and I think it's the same for some of these other services that you can get pretty big, but that's where you back off and say, is the activity you're doing improving the fundamentals of how you are protecting, monitoring, detecting, and responding? Yeah. Because that's what you come back to. And so is your CTI program actually improving your detections, or you're writing a bunch of reports that aren't being read? Is your testing actually then resulting in your blue team improving what they're doing? Or is it the red team's having fun because, look, we managed to get into XYZ server or get into the CEO's mailbox, but you're not taking action on it. And as long as you are taking action and actually improving, then you have not hit your ceiling of the potential you have for the people you might want to hire in those positions.
I'd really like Ingrid's pragmatism here. That's been my experience entirely. One of the other things that I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention, and that is 24/7 and coverage. A lot of people entering this area, like they rush towards, oh, I've got to have every analyst looking at every alert within 3 minutes. And, oh my God, that's expensive. It's really expensive. First of all, I don't think I've ever run into a SOC that was totally symmetrically staffed across the board. At best, I've run into SOCs that are follow the sun, but like, how many SOCs have your engineering team writing detections working at 2 a.m. local? I don't think I've ever met someone doing that, as an extreme example. As a matter of fact, I feel like some people who are new over-index on timeliness over effectiveness. There's been plenty of times where just a couple people doing proactive hunt in their spare time find stuff that were completely missed by routine detections, right? That's why we have hunt. That's the whole point. So it's amazing when you free yourself of some of these assumptions, just how much you can get out of a couple people.
Yep. Absolutely
I
agree
agree.
with everything. Yeah, that was a lot of brilliant statements in that one. We're going to have to cut that up and turn that into a video and get that out just so more people see it, right? I love what was said there. Improving the fundamentals and just kind of making sure you're making constant improvement. I think that's definitely a very pragmatic way of looking at it and trying to figure out, can the team be better if we have extra time? Can we get more advanced, right? And start doing some of those things that we wish we could have done maybe in the past and hadn't started into yet. I think that brings us to the end of this chapter. So in closing here, any final thoughts that anyone has, absolutely key takeaways, references, or otherwise that they'd like to throw in before we wrap up the episode?
Yeah,
All
I
right.
think it is, as if you're a manager of a SOC, it really is that the pipeline has to just keep going. A SOC is a very fluid workforce, and it's a fluid workforce even when you have an awesome environment and an awesome team. People move for personal reasons. People are always moving. So always keeping a lookout on the talent and planning that your great, awesome people are going to leave eventually is key for me.
Yeah.
And I want to go back to our title, which is really about hiring and growing quality staff, and that you can't hire enough people. You have to be part of the community that is growing people, that is creating that pipeline. Because for every person that leaves your organization, somebody else is going to come into your organization that somebody else has trained. And so you have to think of this as a larger community where, it's people are going to move around. People will work with each other, go other places, come back and work with each other. But recognizing that, even as people are moving around, you're just not going to be able to hire everybody that you want. And I think one of the things I've seen is we put a different set of standards on promoting people within our own organizations than we do from hiring externally. And so, a lot of times it'll be like, oh, well, I know XYZ about this person and there's this small flaw, so we can't promote them, but we're going to interview somebody for 2 hours and then we're going to hire them at a higher level. And so really focusing, going back to the title, which is grow your own staff, put the time into it. Yes, they're going to leave. Yes, you're creating a pipeline, but it is absolutely worth the investment for the time that you get the people there, and you will keep them longer if you do that.
Yep. Love it. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for all this, wisdom we had here on hiring people, building teams, whether they're new, whether they're experienced people, all the way up for managers, the importance of communication, being part of the bigger community and kind of thinking about it with those different mindsets. All that stuff I think is very, important, super powerful stuff for people to consider as they go out to build their SOC dream team and the best band they can, right? So with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you, Ingrid, Carson, and Kathryn again for another amazing episode, and we will catch you on the next time on Blueprint.